How many of you have ever seen an old movie now called Jaws? You ever see that? Movie Jaws? Boom, 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 boom. Well, that came out in 1975. I graduated in 1975 after spending 8 of my best years in high school. No, but I did graduate in 1975, and June 20th of that year, Jaws came out. And one of my favorite scenes in that movie is where the chief of police, played by Roy Scheider, I think it's Martin Brody is his character. They're out on a boat, the boat, and they're looking for this shark. And Quint, Robert Shaw, is the captain. And so I forget what Martin Brody's talking about, but he's kneeling down to the side of the boat, and he's doing something. And he's talking back and forth with, I think, the captain. When suddenly, Jaws' head comes up out of that water. And that's the first picture the audience gets of this gigantic shark. And Martin Brody says, "You're gonna need a bigger boat." In other words, your vision of this shark is way too small. In the 13th century, there was a person named Thomas Aquinas. Actually, a lot of what we deal with today theologically in our churches comes from Aquinas. Augustine and Aquinas are considered two huge names in church history and church theology, how it developed. Aquinas wrote tons of stuff. He was a prolific writer. He was a priest, a theologian, a philosopher. And he wrote, his magnum opus is called the Summa Theologica, basically the summary, the summing up of the study of God. Theology is the study of God. But later in his life, he had what can only be described as a mystical encounter with Christ. And in a moment's time, kind of like Paul being caught up into the third heaven, he was so infilled with the reality of Christ that he said, and I paraphrase, he said, "Everything I have written prior to this is like straw by comparison." And he put his pen down and he never wrote again, because nothing could compare now that he had seen a bigger picture of God. He got a bigger boat. Well, we need a bigger view of God. I think it was Albert Einstein who once said the Christian's view of God or concept of God is too small, but we need a bigger boat. We need to expand our horizons on when we talk about God. And part of it is even in understanding this first part of the Lord's Prayer. This isn't an adequate description of the Trinitarian idea of God, but it's one that helps me. I wouldn't argue this probably in a theology class. They'd probably say you're a little off there, but it helps me personally. Maybe it helps you. And I think I've used it here before. But imagine a freshly baked loaf of Amish bread, just like we had in southeastern Iowa. The Amish bake these loaves of bread, and let's call that God. And you break a piece off of that, and you bring it into this sanctuary. And let's call that Jesus, where it's the same essence, the same substance, and it's brought to us. The aroma that fills this room, that wafts through the air, is the Holy Spirit that draws us to Christ, who draws us to God the Father. When we think in terms of God, we think of the aroma that fills the entire cosmos and this earth. Now, when Jesus said, "Our Father who art in heaven," most English translations, with the exception of Young's literal translation and one or two others, translate that singular, heaven singular. But in the Greek, it's actually plural. Bob Zirkelbach and I had a good visit about this a few days ago. The plural use of heavens in the Greek. And so I looked it up to find out more why more English translations don't say heavens in the plural. And I said, well, a lot of it's out of tradition, and in our minds, we think in terms of heaven in a singular sense. We don't think of it like the ancients did. But I think in this case, the way the ancients thought of it is very helpful and closer to the mark likely of what Jesus was saying to us. When we say, "Our Father who art in heaven," where do you think of God as being? Somewhere out there, right? Way out there. But when you understand the notion of the early church, when it said heavens in the plural, it meant the air around us where the birds fly. It meant what we would now call the solar system, or the outer atmosphere and beyond, and then the extreme cosmos, everything beyond that. So Jesus is essentially, in the Lord's Prayer, saying, "Our Father," and this is how I pray it in my own personal devotion every morning. I say, "Our Father who fills the heavens," plural, "near and far." He's as close as my breath, and he fills the cosmos. That's the aroma of God. That's a bigger boat. That's understanding God in larger terms, I think. Well, how do we connect with that? I think that one significant way is following the pattern of the early church that practiced what we now call spiritual disciplines. The early church practiced 4 primary disciplines. They practiced many of them, but what we would call spiritual disciplines of prayer. Prayer was like the umbilical cord for the early church, and I think it should still be that for us. It is what connects us in the most powerful way with Creator God through Christ. Prayer. The second was fasting. If you watch in the book of Acts as you read along, so many times it will say they prayed and fasted, and then they laid hands on someone. They sent off Paul and Barnabas after they'd prayed and fasted. Well, fasting oftentimes involves food, where you fast a meal, you fast a day. I have a friend who recently fasted a week. And so fasting go different lengths. The most common is to fast a meal. And during that time, you just focus extra on the Lord and your time with Him. But there are things other than food that we fast. We can fast anything that has a tendency to have a hold on us. Technology. If we don't think technology has a hold on us, then give it up for a day and see what happens. We can tell pretty quickly if something has a hold on us just by habit. My dad smoked for years and had to quit for health reasons. The doctor said you can't smoke for 3 years because of his heart situation. He said, if I quit, or for 3 months, he said, if I quit for 3 months, I'm never smoking again. And the doctor said, yeah, right. The doctor was quite a smoker himself. But Dad did. But years later, if someone would say, Bill, give me a cigarette, Dad would reach for his pocket. Just that was so ingrained in him. And that cigarette after supper, he said he still would, that was his favorite time probably. So those things get ingrained in us like habits. Well, the spiritual disciplines are a call to sometimes give something up that has a hold on us. So it can be talking. If someone chatters all the time, then try fasting talk a half a day. Take the vow of silence for half a day and find out if talking has a grip on you. Those are things we fast. Anything that has a tendency of creating addiction or a grip on us, we fast. The third discipline they practiced was the Word. They would spend time in the Word. Now for them, the early church, the first century church, it was the Hebrew Scriptures primarily, and then as the letters were being composed, and then later the Gospels were being put together, they would of course study those. But initially, the first decade or two, we're talking the Hebrew Scriptures. They were seeing how Isaiah and the prophets and the Torah all connected to Jesus, the Messiah, Yeshua. And the fourth discipline was worship. They would come together in gathered worship, and they would commune together. So those disciplines became the connection between this God who fills the expanse of the heavens, plural, and our own soul. So today, what I'm looking at is kind of, if I were to put this in a sentence, I'd say living on the rock of Christ, living on the rock, requires a rock-solid rule for living. Living on the rock requires a rock-solid rule for living. And by rule, I don't mean legalistic stuff. I mean a way of living in the rhythm with God, how important that is. Imagine If you're a young person and we were invaded by an outside nation and you were taken captive, we all were, but many of us were killed, and the youngest ones of us were taken captive hundreds, maybe thousands of miles away. And nothing's familiar. You're taken away from family, you're taken away from culture, from things you're familiar with, from a language you're familiar with. How much of our Christian relationship with Jesus is so ingrained in us that we would continue being able to function as followers of Jesus? By the way, just a side thought. Did you know the word Christian is only used 3 times in the New Testament? But the word disciple is used 269 times in the New Testament. That tells us that I think what Jesus had in mind was being a disciple, an apprentice, a follower. And so as we walk in that relationship, if suddenly all of our support was taken from us, what would remain? Well, we actually have a picture of that in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament book of Daniel. Daniel was probably a teenager when he was taken from his homeland of southern Israel, Judah, to live hundreds of miles away in Babylon. He and many young people, hundreds probably, were taken, and they were going to spend the rest of their lives living in Babylon. For 70 years they would live there. How did Daniel maintain such a vigorous, living faith? Well, we can learn something from him. He had a rock-solid rule for living. 3 times a day we know that he prayed. He would go to his window, open up the shutters, look towards Jerusalem, and he prayed. Even when it came to dietary things, because the Jews have a very disciplined way of eating, when the Babylonians wanted him because he was clearly a gifted, we would call them, gifted and talented. He was clearly gifted, and they wanted him to eat their food. And instead of just refusing outright, he also walked in wisdom. So he got with someone who was kind of second in command, and he talked to them. He said, listen, I know this is how you want us, I'm paraphrasing it. I know this is how you want us to eat. I've got a deal to propose to you. If you let us eat the way we like to eat, lots of vegetables and not all this fatty stuff, and if after 10 days we're not healthier than the other young people that you're feeding all the cuisine you're giving them, then we'll eat what you're eating. But if we're healthier, then you'll let us eat our diet. So the guy took that to the leader, and he said, here's what's being proposed. What do you think? Okay, let's give it a try. They did, and they ended up being allowed to eat what they ate. So he had that rock-solid rule for living integrated within his life. That was one of the things that defined him, set him apart from others. If I could go back, that caused him to be defined by the divine. How important that is. What defines us? Are we defined by the external or the internal? So, Daniel then rose in power and great influence, and there were people jealous of him. And as you probably remember the story, a group of people that got with the king and said, King, you're wonderful, flattered him. You're wonderful, you're great. I think we should all just be praying to you and not let anyone pray to any other god but you, because you're just so awesome. And the king let the ego be stroked, and he said, thought it over? That's a really great idea. And so no one was to pray to any other god. Well, guess what Daniel did? 3 times a day, opened up his shutters and prayed to the living God. So those people who were jealous of him, the king, by the way, loved Daniel, but hadn't thought this thing through very well. And so the people that hated Daniel went to the king and said, King, didn't you make a decree that no one was to pray to any other god except you during this time? And he said, yeah, I did that. They said, well, Daniel is praying to his God. The king was really sad because he loved Daniel. So then he was trying to figure a loophole in this, but he didn't have enough good lawyers. They couldn't figure out how to get out of it. So they had to throw Daniel in the lion's den. So there he was, and the king brooded all night. First thing in the morning, he runs out there, even before he gets to Starbucks. He runs out, has them take the stone or whatever it was guarding the lion's den, and he yells down and he says, "Daniel, dude, are you okay?" He doesn't really say dude, that's Boatman paraphrase. And Daniel says, "I'm good, O king. The Lord has protected me." And the king is thrilled about it, so he pulls Daniel out of there and he punishes all those who were his conspirators, who hated him. The point is, Daniel had a rule for living, a rhythm of living his life, so that even though he was transported hundreds of miles away, his life was built around something internal, not something external. I've read a couple of times Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And it's his account of surviving Auschwitz and other prison camps that he and other Jews did. And it's an interesting conclusion that he comes to. He said, and I'm paraphrasing him as well, but basically he said that those who survived that had a strong internal framework of who they were. Those who did not survive were dependent upon outward circumstances and other people to tell them who they were. He said, so when we were stripped down, literally stripped down, and everything taken from us, standing in the cold, totally dehumanized was the attempt of the Nazis. He said the only way to survive that is to have something inside, not to be dependent upon external things, because all of that had been removed. A great part of the rock-solid rule for living is having an inward construct, an inward framework for life, so that we're not dependent upon the external. Paul and Silas, remember the story? We've been there in Greece, where the site that they think was where the prison was, where Paul and Silas were put in the prison. It says in the innermost part, they were in stocks, they had been beaten, and at midnight, remember what they were doing? They were singing praises, weren't they? Singing praises to God at the midnight hour, and the earthquake came. But the point is, that was not based upon external things. They were not crying the blues. Instead, they were praising God, because joy is not contingent upon external circumstances. Happiness is, but joy is not. Jesus said, those who believe in me, as the scripture has said, out of their innermost being shall flow rivers of living water. That's joy. And that comes from inside of us. So, there are a couple of things that hinder us in walking in this, what I would call the spiritual disciplines of prayer and fasting and the word and worship. One of them is legalism. We can tend to take something that was meant to be good and helpful, that connects us to the heavenly realm, and we become legalistic about it. And that's what this scripture mentions towards the end. It is not that we think we are qualified, Paul's talking, it's not that we think we are qualified to do anything on our own. Our qualification comes from God, and He has qualified us as ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. So he's contrasting the legalistic tendency, an aspect of the law of the Jewish people, with the Spirit immersion that the new Christians or the believers or the disciples of Jesus had. For the letter kills, he said, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. They kind of give you an example of how that happened, an example of when that happened. The Pharisees get kind of a bum rap, and probably for good reason. By the time Jesus comes along, there were actually two groups of Pharisees. One was a more strict group, and one was less strict. And a lot of times Jesus' run-in was probably with the highly strict group of Pharisees. But when Pharisees first started, it was actually a good thing, because when the identity of the Jewish people was in serious jeopardy during these tumultuous times of occupation, then people were separated from the temple, and eventually the temple would be destroyed, of course. People were separated from that. It was the Pharisees who emerged that focused on the word, or what they called the Torah, the law. And originally, it actually kept people held together with an identity. The synagogue was developed around that. where you would have people come together and they would listen to the word being read. And the Pharisees, in their origins, in their beginnings, were actually really good, it seems, at trying to apply it to everyday life. How do we live this out? We're surrounded by an oppressive nation, an empire. How do we live out our covenant with God in a way that's practical every day? And so initially, they saw the word as a way to look through the window to God. But in time, they started focusing on the window, not looking through the window. So after a time, they started looking at the specks on the windows. Well, we've got to clean that. We've got to get that better. The framing needs repainted, and everything became a new law to live better and to hold people to. And so pretty soon, they've got all these added laws to keep the window clean so that no one taints the window, and people forgot to look through the window. Now they're looking at the window, and that's legalism. We can do that with the Bible. The Bible is meant to be a window for us to look through to Jesus. But we can start getting so legalistic about, do you believe it this way? Are you interpreting this the same way I do? And we suddenly are looking at the window, keeping everyone looking at the window of how we interpret everything, and we forget that the Scripture is meant for us to look through and experience this living, vital relationship with Jesus. The letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. So one of the enemies of the spiritual disciplines is to actually create a legalistic approach to it and a self-righteous approach to it. No, they're just meant to be a window through which we interact with Jesus. The second enemy is what we might just call laziness. So you got legalism and laziness. The Bible calls it being a sluggard. That just doesn't sound good any way you spread that on. It just doesn't sound good, does it? Sluggard. I mean, there should be t-shirts with that. But a sluggard says, there are four characteristics of a sluggard, i.e. A lazy person's mindset. Now, first of all, let me say, laziness is ubiquitous. All of us experience laziness in some way. Someone may say, well, I work 75 hours a week. And in that area, you're not lazy. But you might be lazy spiritually. You might be lazy economically. You might be lazy intellectually. We don't know. All of us are lazy in some areas. M. Scott Peck, in his book, The Road Less Traveled, he suggests that laziness is the original sin. I don't think that's accurate, but he makes an interesting case that even laziness caused Adam, he believes, to not confront Eve with what she was doing because he just didn't want the anxiety that would create. So he calls that a form of laziness. Be that as it may. A sluggard says there's a lion in the road, a fierce lion roaming the streets. So what's the deal with that? Well, I was looking this up. That would be so rare for a fierce lion to be in the city streets of Jerusalem. It'd be like being struck by lightning, basically. And so the sluggard or the highly lazy person exaggerates the situation in order to excuse himself or herself from doing something that he or she needs to do. So this exaggeration, oh, I can never go out, I can never do that because of this, and then it's some excuse that we make. One of the things I learned with the Quakers, those who live as Quakers, because Quakers, like anyone, you have nominal Quakers, and then you have people who are actually trying to be practitioners of it. And those who are trying to live out the values of Quaker Christianity are oftentimes not quick to speak. And they don't just say a lot of extra words, and they don't make a lot of excuses, if any. And so, like if you say to someone who's a practicing Quaker, are you going to be able to come to this and that you're kind of wanting people to come to? Are you going to be able to come to that? They may just say no. And then you're waiting for the excuse, and the excuse doesn't happen because Jesus said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. So they try to, as much as they can, abide by that. This is just the opposite, where they make these far-fetched excuses as to why they can't do something. And then the second characteristic, as the door turns on its hinges, so a sluggard turns on his bed. What do you think that means? I think it's talking about like being addicted to sleep or addicted to the bed, or maybe addicted to anything that is a form of escape that allows you not to have to deal with something that you need to deal with. It's a way of escape. Thirdly, a sluggard buries his hand in the dish. He is too lazy to bring it back to his mouth. I get this image of church potlucks, and you've got a sluggard in front of you, and just slovenly and a sluggard, and he puts his hand down in the dish, and he's just too tired to bring it up again. He just holds his body and his elbow down in whatever it is, that casserole you were waiting for. And not only does he ruin it for himself, he ruins it for everyone else. The sluggard is insensitive to what he does and how it impacts other people, and pretty selfish with how he deals with resources. And finally, a sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 people who answer discreetly. You know, I know better than they do, and when he or she really doesn't. But that's what they rely on, and can see the fruits of that. Well, a couple quick examples of that. Years ago, we counseled a young lady in I think it was our church in Eldora, and she and her husband, young husband, were having some financial problems. And she came and we were visiting, and so I just started talking to her because I've got some background in that stuff. I just started talking to her about her budget, or lack thereof. And tell me some things you spend money on, because they weren't a huge amount short, but they were short every month. And had her go through her day, and she said, well, I stop and get coffee on my way to, she was I think a nurse, worked in the medical field. I stop and get coffee. Wait. Where do you get coffee? Well, like Starbucks. I said, oh, well, how much you spend on that every day? And I think she spent like $5 a day on coffee. I said, so 5 days a week. That's $25 a week, right? And that's about $100 a month. And in 10 months, that's $1,000. Well, that adds up. And so we began to look at little things, just little things. And to her credit, she said, that's right. She started making her own coffee at home. And she saved up that money, and they bought a couch that they needed with the money she saved up from Starbucks. That's someone who saw wise counsel given to her and acted on it. Caleb was showing me a video. There's a young guy, I forget his name, but he's in his 30s, and he gives financial advice, tends to give it to younger people, because people like Dave Ramsey, you know, older duffers like us, he not like you, like me, and he gives wonderful financial advice. I mean, basically it's listening to my dad. But as Caleb says, Caleb's 25, he doesn't always relate to young people's struggles today in quite the way that they're used to hearing things or need to hear things. So there's this 30-some-year-old young guy. I mean, he looks like he's 18, but I guess he's in his 30s. And he gives financial advice, and so I listened to it. He's pretty good, actually. He's got a kind of a low-key way of doing it. But this young lady came to him who was $75,000 in debt. I'm assuming school debt. I don't know. And she came to him for counsel. And so the little bit we saw on YouTube, he's going through her budget. And he sees, okay, so she's behind every month. And he sees Spotify. You're spending 10 or 11 bucks a month on that. Let's get rid of that. And she said, no, I can't get rid of that. That's a quality of life issue. It's a quality of life. You can get for free if you just listen to the ads. And so, but she was resisting to that. No, I'm not going to do that. And he said, listen, you're the one who came to me, $75,000 in debt, and I'm trying to help you. But I'm sensing some resistance here in helping you. I think we have a case of this. She was wiser in her own eyes than someone who wasn't in debt, who was able to live economically in a more successful way. So learning from those around us is a really important thing. But one of the two things that will become obstacles to the spiritual disciplines: legalism. We start becoming self-righteous about it, because everyone needs to kind of learn in his or her own way how to follow this pattern of the early church of prayer, fasting, worship, the word. But we need to do it in a way that we can learn from it. And it's not a one-size-fits-all as we learn to practice the spiritual discipline. And the second thing is a form of laziness. And we all have it in different areas. And so it's acknowledging it. You can't change what you don't acknowledge. So it's acknowledging that we need to make those changes. And do this. Proverbs chapter 4, verses 20 through 23. It says, my child, pay attention. Pay attention to what I say. Listen carefully to my words. Don't lose sight of them. What's that look like for you? We've got to figure that out on our own. What's it look like to not lose sight of the words? Some people put them on mirrors so they can, when the first thing in the morning they do. Some people say breath prayers. I don't know. We find different ways to not lose sight of them. Let them penetrate deep into your heart. Lorraine's got all these flowers, outdoor flowers that she waters, and some indoor plants that she waters, and she lets the water just soak deeply into them. And that's what we do with the Word and Spirit. Let it penetrate deep into your heart. For they bring life. That's the reason we do. It brings life to those who find them, and healing to their whole body. So it aligns us in such a way that God's life touches every part of who we are. Guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. I think it was C.S. Lewis who said something like that every choice we make brings us a step closer or a step farther from the kingdom of God. Every choice we make. Our life is made up of this body of choices. And are we stepping towards the kingdom or away from the kingdom? Well, the kingdom of the heavens. God fills the air around us and the cosmos above us. And are we practicing those things that help align us to be able to soak in the fullness of who God is? Is our God too small? Or is our God such that we need a bigger boat in order to soak it all in? So remember, we're not defined by the external, but we are defined by the internal, by the